Welcome back to the Olive Grove podcast. We're kicking off our special segment, The Deep Dive.
That's right. And today we're exploring some fascinating excerpts from MCS Acts chapter 25.
Yeah, it's a really compelling section. We get this close look at the Apostle Paul facing his third trial, believe it or not.
Third time. It's quite something.
It really is. And we're tracing the events that will eventually lead him to Rome. This wasn't just, a legal detour.
No, not at all. It ties into a prophecy about him testifying about Jesus before rulers.
Exactly. And it makes you think, doesn't it? How these big, maybe even divine purposes can unfold through, politics and legal systems.
Absolutely. So our mission today, if you like, is to really unpack the key moments in this chapter.
Understand Paul's situation, what was driving his opponents.
And how it all fits into that bigger story of the early church.
Okay, so let's dive in. First up is the arrival of Festus, the new governor. And like you said, this is Paul's third trial.
Yeah, that alone tells you about the kind of persistent opposition he was facing.
So Festus takes over from Felix, who'd been there for 2 years.
Right. And Festus pretty quickly heads up from Caesarea to Jerusalem.
And the leadership there doesn't waste any time, do they? The text says the head Kohanim and the Judean leaders brought Paul's case right to him.
They did. These head Kohanim were chief priests. They were the main religious authorities, held a lot of sway, even politically, under Roman rule.
So their word carried weight with a new governor trying to get the lay of the land.
Definitely. And they came with a specific request.
They wanted Festus to bring Paul to Jerusalem.
Yes. But it wasn't just about jurisdiction or convenience for them.
No, there was something much darker going on underneath, right?
Absolutely. The scripture's very clear. They were plotting an ambush. The plan was to kill Paul while he was being transported.
Wow. They had plotted to have him ambushed and killed en route. That's intense.
It shows the level of hatred, the danger Paul was constantly in.
And it does make you think about themes of intolerance, maybe like you see foreshadowed later in Revelation, systems turning against belief.
It's a recurring pattern, isn't it? People using the structures of power, political or legal, to try and silence voices they oppose. Paul's situation really highlights that.
Okay, so they make this deadly request. How does Festus, the new guy, respond? Does he just go along with it?
Well, thankfully for Paul, no. Festus actually throws a wrench in their plans.
How so?
He basically says, look, Paul's being held down in Caesarea, and I'm heading back there soon anyway. And he tells them, so let competent men among you come down with me and press charges against the man if he has done something wrong.
So he turns it back on them. You want to press charges? Fine. Come to Caesarea and do it properly.
Exactly. He calls their bluff, essentially, and that completely scuttles their ambush plot.
That's a crucial moment, especially when you think about that prophecy of Paul needing to get to Rome.
It does feel significant, yeah. Like maybe events were being guided to protect that purpose.
So Festus heads back to Caesarea as promised. What happens next?
He doesn't wait long.
Yeah.
After maybe, 8 or 10 days in Jerusalem, he's back in Caesarea.
Right.
And the very next day, he convenes the court. Acts 25.6 says, he took his seat in court and ordered Shaul to be brought in.
And this trial itself, it's another step towards fulfilling that prophecy we mentioned, about Paul speaking before kings and rulers.
It absolutely is. Standing before Festus, a Roman governor, is part of that journey. And, the text sort of hints that just like God had this plan for Paul,
he might have plans and purposes for us too, like Ephesians 2.next suggests.
That's the idea. It's an encouraging thought connecting these big historical events to, maybe our own lives.
So Paul's in court. The Judean leaders are there from Jerusalem. What charges do they actually bring this time?
Well, the text says they brought many serious charges against him.
There's always a but with these charges, isn't there?
Which they could not prove.
There's...
Same old story, really. Lots of accusations, no substance.
It's a pattern, and the text draws a parallel, doesn't it, between Paul's persecution and what Jesus went through.
It does. It suggests that, following this path often involves facing opposition. It even points to Ephesians 6 about being prepared for these kinds of struggles.
So, facing these serious but unproven charges, how does Paul defend himself?
He keeps it simple, very direct. He basically says, I haven't done anything wrong, not against Jewish law, not against the temple, and certainly not against the emperor.
No long arguments, just a clear statement of innocence.
Exactly. He refuses to get bogged down.
Now, Festus, the text calls him a politician. What's the significance of that description here?
Well, it suggests his priority might be keeping the peace, balancing interests. appeasing the local leaders would probably be high on his list as the new governor.
Right, trying to maintain stability and maybe his own standing.
Precisely.
And that political thinking seems to shape his next move, doesn't it? His question to Paul.
It really does. Because Festus, it says, wanted to gain favor with the Judeans. So he asks Paul.
Yeah.
He asks, would you be willing to go up to Jerusalem and be tried before me there on these charges?
Even though the trial is happening right there in Caesarea, he suggests moving it back to Jerusalem.
Yeah, which would play right into the hands of the Judean leaders.
It sounds like he's trying to appease them, maybe even suspecting their hostility, but prioritizing politics.
That seems very likely.
Mm-hmm.
Whether he knew the specifics of the ambush plot or not, offering to move the trial looks like political expediency.
Okay, so Paul hears this. He knows the plan is Rome. He probably senses Festus is playing politics.
Mm-hmm.
What does he do? He surely can't agree to go back to Jerusalem.
No way. He likely sees it as a trap, or at least incredibly dangerous. He stands firm.
How does he respond?
He refuses. He asserts his rights. He says something like, look, I'm standing in the emperor's court right now. This is where I should be tried. I've done nothing wrong to the Judeans, as you yourself know.
He calls Festus out a bit there, as you very well know.
A subtle but pointed reminder. And then he makes his move.
The big one.
Yes. He invokes his right as a Roman citizen. I appeal to the emperor.
That's a game changer.
It is. And the source material stresses this wasn't about fearing death. It was about fulfilling God's plan for him to get to Rome, to testify at the highest level. He had the right, and he used it.
So Paul plays his trump card. How does Festus react to this direct appeal to Caesar?
Well, he has to consider it seriously. He consults with his advisors, his counsel,
Right.
and then he gives the formal reply. You have appealed to the emperor. You will go to the emperor.
Decision made. Paul's going to Rome.
It seems Festus probably saw this as, well, a convenient solution.
Gets Paul off his hands, avoids further conflict with the local leaders.
Exactly. Passes the buck, essentially, to the authorities in Rome.
Okay, so the immediate crisis is averted for Paul, but the story isn't over. King Agrippa shows up.
That's right. A little while later, King Agrippa and his sister Bernice arrive in Caesarea. It's a formal visit, paying respects to the new governor.
A courtesy call.
Pretty much. But Festus sees an opportunity here.
To explain this rather awkward situation with Paul.
Precisely. He lays out the case for Agrippa. And, interestingly, he kind of subtly shifts the blame around.
How so?
He mentions how his predecessor, Felix, just left Paul in custody, and how the Judean leaders were pressuring him, Festus, to condemn Paul back in Jerusalem.
Making himself look reasonable while highlighting the actions of others. Classic political maneuvering.
It seems that way. He's presenting his actions in the best possible light to King Agrippa.
How else does he justify how he handled it?
He frames it in terms of Roman law. He says, it's not our custom to just hand someone over. The accused has to face their accusers, get a chance to defend themselves.
Right. Pointing to the trial he already held in Caesarea.
Yes. He also admits the charges weren't what he expected, not serious crimes against Rome.
What did he say they were about?
He describes them as certain points of their own religion, and particularly about somebody called Yeshua, who had died, but who Scholl claimed is alive.
You can almost hear his confusion, like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Right. He admits being baffled by these theological arguments, and even mentions again that he'd initially suggested sending Paul to Jerusalem, just to get it sorted out by people who understood it better.
And then he kind of puts the current situation squarely on Paul's shoulders, doesn't he?
He does. He basically says, well, Paul appealed to the emperor, so now I have to hold him until I can send him to Rome.
More blame shifting. Always someone else's fault or decision.
It's a common tactic, isn't it?
It is. And it's at this moment, after hearing Festus's account, that Agrippa gets interested.
Exactly. Agrippa says to Festus, I myself have been wanting to hear the man.
He wants to hear Paul directly.
Yeah, and Festus agrees immediately. Tomorrow, you will hear him. This sets up another significant encounter for Paul.
Another ruler, just as prophesied.
Precisely.
And the scene when Paul is brought before Agrippa, it's described as quite grand, isn't it?
Oh, very much so. The text says, Agrippa and Bernice arrived with much pageantry. They come into the hall with high-ranking military officers leading citizens. It's a formal audience.
And then Paul is brought in. It really emphasizes that this isn't just some minor legal hearing anymore.
No, this is significant. Paul is literally standing before kings and prominent leaders.
And even here, Festus is still trying to explain himself, right, to justify sending Paul to Rome.
He is. He addresses the whole assembly. He repeats how the Jewish community, both in Jerusalem and Caesarea, had complained about Paul, demanding his execution.
But he also repeats his own finding.
Right. That he, Festus, found Paul hadn't done anything deserving death. But he insists, because Paul himself appealed, well, his hands were tied, he had to send him.
Still framing it as Paul's choice forcing his hand.
Seems like it.
And Festus then admits his core problem, the reason for this whole hearing with Agrippa.
Yes, he confesses he doesn't actually know what specific charges to write in his report to the emperor.
He says, I have nothing specific to write to His Majesty, which is awkward.
Very awkward. That's why he brought Paul before Agrippa. He's hoping Agrippa, who understands Jewish matters better, might hear Paul and help Festus figure out what to actually put in the letter.
He even says it seems unreasonable to send a prisoner without specifying any charges.
Yeah, he recognizes the absurdity of his position. It's all political maneuvering, but underneath it, you see this larger purpose unfolding, getting Paul closer to Rome, even if Festus has no clue about that.
It's been fascinating digging into this chapter, seeing the opposition, the politics, Paul's steadfastness, and how his appeal moved things forward.
Absolutely. It shows how unexpected paths can lead towards a foreseen goal, even through messy human situations.
Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, we want to pause for a moment and highlight the really important work of Enduring Freedom Ministries, or EFM.
Yes, EFM is truly making a difference on the ground. They provide things like a hot meal, groceries, clothing, even haircuts and laundry services for people who are really struggling.
These are basic essentials, but they mean so much, and you can directly help. If you're able to, please consider donating just $4 a month to EFM.
Just $4. That covers the cost of providing all those essential services for one person for a month. It's a small amount that makes a huge impact.
You can find the details on how to donate right there in our show notes. Please think about it.
And another way to support and learn more is by getting the book Misfits for Jesus, True Accounts of People Experiencing Jesus. It's available on Amazon.
It shares incredible, true stories about God's work through EFM. Really powerful stuff.
It really is. It shows what can happen when people step out in faith.
And one last thing, if you enjoy these deep dives, please subscribe to the Olive Grove podcast on YouTube. It helps us keep these conversations going.
Okay, so back to Acts 25. We've seen Paul navigate this incredibly complex legal and political maze.
Yeah, facing down accusers, dealing with governors, trying to please different factions, but always focused on his mission.
And ultimately using his rights as a citizen to align with what he understood as God's plan for him.
It really sets the stage for his appearance before Agrippa, which we'll likely explore more later. But it leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it?
It does.
For you, our listener, think about people of faith throughout history and even today. How do they navigate complex systems, political, legal, social, while staying true to their core beliefs? What lessons can we maybe take from their experiences as we navigate our own complicated world?
That's definitely something worth reflecting on.